Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. In 1818, Percy Bysshe Shelley captured the disintegration of a regime undone by hubristic overreach. But nearly 7,000 years before Shelley's Ozymandias, we see the rise of Earth's first true ever city, Uruk. Imagine a place 2 millennia before the pyramids, where up to 60,000 people, which is about the size of modern-day Inverness, lived on a now dry branch of the Euphrates River. So at Uruk's heart, and arguably its brain, stood its temples. It had canals winding through sun-baked clay walls. They served as lifelines, almost like veins running through this city. You'd see scribes perched on tile embankments overlooking acres of irrigated farmland. They would be chiselling wages, crop yields, and even pottery into wet clay. This was the world's first ever writing system, and it wasn't born out of philosophy, art, or literature, but instead necessity. So for millennia, Uruk thrived, but gradually it unravelled. So how does a hub of vitality collapse into the now wind-scoured ruins of Warka, which is what it's known as today, in southern Iraq? In this talk, I'll explore the 3 pillars that held Uruk up and the collapse of one crucial pillar, which brought the others crashing down. So I'm going to start with what I believe to be Uruk's most crucial lifeline, which was its institutions. To understand this, we need to understand what defines a city, and why does Uruk, and not, say, Jericho, which is an older settlement, not count as the first city? So Uruk was propped up by a system of temples, which I alluded to earlier. The temples were aided by irrigation, bureaucracy, and trade. But these systems were so centralised and so brittle that when they eventually snapped, everything else in the city was left trunkless. So firstly, Uruk had what was called the temple economy, practically meaning that all economic activity and trade was centralised in what's called the Eanna precinct. The Eanna precinct was dedicated to the Sumerian goddess of love, war and fertility, Inanna. The temple owned land, collected grain, pottery, textiles, and then it would redistribute them to craftsmen, farmers and other tradesmen in the city. This primordial bureaucracy allowed for the Uruk's anchor of surplus to become reliable. This fostered specialisation and urbanisation. Uruk's metaphysical authority systems were supported by the construction of irrigation and agriculture. We call Uruk the Venice of the desert, and that's for good reason. The centralised temple organised corvée labour, so practically slave labour, to dig canals from the Euphrates. This turned arid land into wheat fields, and this was able to feed the city and promote trade. This idea of feeding the city with surplus is crucial as it allows for long-term projects, like construction of irrigation or temples to take place. When there's full-time subsistence farming, there's no time to do anything else. You've just got to be farming the whole time. But when there's a surplus, you can do kind of other activities. So, as I previously mentioned, Uruk and its systems springboarded the creation of humanity's first ever writing system. It was born, as I said, out of pure necessity. And this also created the field of accounting. So clay tokens, known as bullae, were used to count sheep. However, this evolved into a style of wedge-like symbols, used not for fiction or literature, but instead accounting. This led to an entirely new social class of scribes emerging, and the ability for institutions to not only store material goods, but the non-tangible treasures of information too. However, this is one of the many forms of social inequality and that ostracised the majority of Uruk's illiterate population, which we'll see is devastating to the city later on. So another aspect of Uruk's temple administrative systems was that of long-distance trade. Uruk's surplus was intrinsically more than necessary for the population of up to 60,000 to live on. So therefore textiles, stone beads, ceramics and grain from Uruk were all found to have reached Anatolia, the Iranian plateau and even as far as the Gulf. So by no means was Uruk in a trade deficit, as Habuba Kabira, which is an outpost in Syria, for example, would send things like copper, timber, lapis lazuli back to Uruk. So they were in this nice trade equilibrium. So despite all of this, there's an irony. The very things that made Uruk powerful which was its intimate and contiguous inter-temple, state and economic systems, they lacked diversity and in turn made it catastrophically vulnerable. To be more specific, elite overreach and rigidity was reflected by the loss of communities and fractured loyalty as greed took place. This may sound familiar to more contemporary issues. In addition, their reliance on irrigation led to its overuse and therefore soil salinisation. This utterly collapsed wheat yields and barley barely held on. As a self-serving bureaucracy abandoned northern trading posts between 3200 BC and 3000 BC, inequality grew, social unrest spread, and emigration increased. The ultra-taut tapestry of Sumerian administration unravelled. And this is not to say that Uruk's elites and their hubris was the only reason for its collapse. But before I reveal the other pillars, I want you to think about the applicability of my previous point to sort of neo-urban settlements, and if the same can be said for the following two pillars, which are climatic pressures and human agency. So we'll start with the more tangible of the two, which is the mid-Holocene aridity event in about 3200 BC, perfectly lines up with Uruk's years of decline thousands of years ago. Sediment cores have been taken from the now dry beds of the Euphrates, and they show that in this period, dry conditions resulted in river channels shifting, which turned irrigated, lush crop fields into salt-filled plains. In this period, canals were clogged, wells were dried, and yields completely fell. Not only were crops starved, but this water insecurity completely undermined the social contract between temple and citizen, which was the promise of bounty and surplus. People naturally don't like scarcity. Communities had to fight over who could and could not afford Uruk's falling surplus, and this caused trade to stagnate and people to move on. So the idea of people moving on leads me briefly onto my final pillar. Humans aren't like pebbles in a stream or bricks on a wall. Instead, they have agency. It's completely irrational to stay in a place where the push factors outweigh the pull factors. Uruk's proof of this. So why should the pinnacle of human ingenuity lead to overcrowding, corvée labour, and a huge social disparity? Areas in Upper Mesopotamia and Anatolia offer more relaxed governance, untapped farmland, and new markets. This imbalance in potential living standards, alongside the innate desire for freedom, fairness, and amelioration, furthered the diffusion of Uruk's innovation. The same roads that once carried Uruk's surplus also carried its most crucial product, her population. Like a burr-covered dog, Uruk's people took the seeds of urbanism elsewhere. So ultimately, of all these three forces, institutions, climate, and human agency, they all played a role, but this role was not equal. Climatic stress is real, and so is migration, but a strong, responsive institution could have adapted to these changes. The problem was that Uruk's elites didn't respond. They clung to power. They decided not to change. They refused. And they decided to let a system rot rather than reforming this old system. And this is why Uruk is more than ancient history. Uruk's story isn't only about clay tablets, temples, and perhaps Gilgamesh. Instead, it's a warning about the fragility of complex systems that run rife today and the danger of ignoring environmental limits, which again, run rife today. And this is what happens when leaders fail to adapt. Your city becomes an archaeological site in the middle of a desert. So cities today, aren't so different. We too rely too tightly on wound systems of logistics, governance, and infrastructure. So when one fails, the others are pulled down with it, perhaps. So what can we learn from the fall of Uruk? Maintain your institutions, listen to your people, adapt to your environment. Otherwise, the sands will come for us too. Thank you very much.